Good break. Now we're back at it here. We're going to start a panel now on transportation reform, and we've got a great member here to talk to you about this. Tom Graves is really an emerging star in the conservative movement. Last year, he achieved Sentinel status on the Heritage Action Scorecard. He's been a leader all over the place, plays in all the major issues that conservatives care about. In Congress, Tom's on the Appropriations Committee, which is a lonely place for conservatives. But this assignment means that Tom's on the front lines of the battle to solve America's debt crisis. He works to balance the budget, cut government waste, reform Congress so that we can focus on saving taxpayer dollars. He's not afraid to think big. The bill that he's going to talk about today is one of those very big issues. Imagine being able to teach Washington a lesson in founding principles. Specifically, a lesson in federalism, a lesson about devolving power to the states, about allowing decisions to take place closer to the people that those decisions actually impact. It's this mentality that led Tom to take on one of Washington's sacred cows, which is transportation spending. Tom's bill would transform the top-down federal approach to transportation spending. It would cut red tape and other federal requirements. It would lower the federal gas tax and give states more flexibility while enabling the private sector to partner and flourish in transportation projects. Please join me in welcoming Tom Graves today to talk about this proposal.
Well, thank you, Tim, and Heritage for having me join you today, and for all those that are interested in these very important issues that we're dealing with as a country and some of the solutions that are being proposed. As you know, the next few minutes we'll be talking about transportation, and in particular the Transportation Empowerment Act that I've been joined with Senator Mike Lee as the Senate sponsor, and myself as the sponsor in the House. So I'm going to start today with a very bold claim. What if we said that this bill would provide better roads for all states without raising taxes? Let me say, let that sink in. Sort of sounds like a campaign promise, a political speech, right? Better roads in all states without raising taxes. That is the Transportation Empowerment Act, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit first about the history of how we do transportation in our country. You can go back to 1956 when the Highway Trust Fund was first created. It was the House Ways and Means Committee, and they were debating this new innovative way, new innovation and this project of building interstates across our country. They originally started with just a couple proposals, and that was 6 interstates, 3 going north and south and 3 going east and west. Very simple. The plan was to collect a 3% excise tax, and that was for each gallon of gas that one would purchase for 15 years, just for 15 years, sunsetted, to pay for this project. But in fiscal year 1972, the tax was supposed to drop to 1.5 cents per gallon. Now, at this time, if you go back and you look back at some of the debates that were taking place, it was Congressman Hale Boggs and George Fallon who noted that once the interstate system was built, there was no need for the government to continue imposing the tax on the American people. Well, surprise. The tax never dropped. Instead, it's only risen. And it's now up to 18.4 cents per gallon, the excise tax that we have today. So what happened? Well, part of the story, it went from 6 interstates to now the about 50 interstates that we have throughout our country. And you might think with over 50 interstates, the highway system's complete, and the gas tax can be lowered, right? Well, wrong. It hasn't been lowered. In recent years, highway legislation has moved well beyond highway, and it is more about spending tax dollars on bike paths and flowers and medians and other special projects, museums and such. And for fiscal year 2014, here most recently, $820 million is authorized for these so-called transportation alternatives. We've come a long way, have we not? And when the federal government is focused on highways, the money is not being spent efficiently. We have the Davis-Bacon wage laws and duplicative federal studies, permitting, and red tape that continue to drive up these costs and slow down these projects. The U.S. Department of Transportation's own studies Their own reports and claims indicate that federal compliance can add nearly 10 years to the approval process of important projects throughout the states. In fact, due to federal regulations, there are 58 road projects in my state of Georgia, that are being delayed right now. So the question is why? One rare bat was spotted last summer. And it's not the wooden kind that you would see a Hank Aaron autograph on. But it was spotted in Georgia, they say, and now the Georgia Department of Transportation has to put up nets and begin catching bats. The cost on average, $100,000 per project, and it could delay an additional 50 projects. It seems like this rare bat is spreading all across North Georgia right now. So instead of widening two-lane roads throughout our North Georgia districts or throughout South Georgia, or in the congested areas in rush hour, our Department of Transportation now is trapping bats. Over the last 50 years, the loss of time and money on road projects across the country has snowballed. Currently, in this current transportation bill that we're operating under, it spends over $40 billion. But it requires over 25% of that to be subsidized from other sources of federal taxes that are collected from citizens across our country. It's subsidized, in fact. Keep in mind now, all of this was supposed to have been paid for by the gasoline tax, the excise tax, that 3.7, or the 3% originally that ballooned to 18.4, but it's not anymore. So you might say to yourself, well, I pump my gas, I pay my taxes, and the money comes back to me in better roads. After all, it costs money to fill in the potholes and make these repairs that are necessary. But the opposite is likely true. You see, potholes and unfixed roads are there today because, in many cases, your tax dollars never come back to your states. Today, there are 37 states that are referred to as donor states. They spend more in taxes and on red tape than they get back. One of those states is Georgia, and our projected rate of return is about 84% this fiscal year, meaning that Georgia taxpayers will lose $185 million that could be spent on road projects that they pay in excise taxes. So let's imagine what we could do with all this money we're losing this year. With less red tape, construction would move faster, more projects would get done quicker, they would cost less. With more funding, we could expand and build roads and connect new communities to each other. What does that mean in the everyday life of a Georgian? With an extra $185 million, the commute might be just a little bit shorter. Maybe you make it home in time to have dinner with your family. Maybe you make it to a few more soccer games. Maybe you can run a few more errands instead of looking at the brake lights that are there in front of you. Better highways could also mean access to more affordable housing, helping you connect wherever you want to live to wherever you want to work. You see, when conservatives try to stop wasteful spending and cumbersome government programs, it's not just about debt and balance sheets. It's about making lives better for everyday Americans. So here's what the Transportation Empowerment Act does. First, I have to give credit to the T-Act, or I guess of the T-Act, to where it's due, because there's many of folks who have been involved in this for many years. The proposal has been in one form or another since 1996. It's been supported by Democrats and Republicans. This is a bipartisan concept. And we certainly have to pay respects to the leader of Heritage, Jim DeMint, who was the Senate sponsor and the champion during his days in the U.S. Senate, who handed the baton off to me a few years ago. And so now I'm working with Senator Lee. Here's how the bill works. The Transportation Empowerment Act is a plan to reform the bankrupt, messy, and unfair federal highway program into a more efficient, locally controlled system that improves the quality of life for every driver and commuter in America. Over a 5-year period, almost all authority over the federal highway and transit programs would be transferred to the states, federalism. During the 5-year phase-out, states would receive block grants that come with less regulation and less red tape. Fewer strings are attached. The federal gas tax would be lowered at the end of this period, at the end of the 5-year period, to 3.7 cents per gallon instead of the 18.4 cents today. And with that remaining 3.7 cents, the bill preserves the original purpose of the federal government's involvement in highway funding. for true interstate construction, roads on federal lands, the research to ensure that all states have access to the best practices and the latest information. And according to the National Taxpayer Union, we would save $71 billion on the federal level over the next 10 years. That's an amazing savings while empowering the states. And meanwhile, think about the states, the positions that they would have. They'd be able to choose whatever funding stream that they wish. They could match the federal gas tax level, or they could eliminate the gas tax altogether. They could raise revenue through other consumption-based methods, like the sales tax or tolls. They could choose something totally different. They could choose a 21st century solution to tackle this 20th century problem we have. State dollars would go much, much further. You would not have unreasonable federal red tape or the delays. You would not have the extra 10% cost of Davis-Bacon. You wouldn't have the 10 years that the Federal Transportation Department says is on every project. States could learn from each other and find the most efficient and effective systems, competition amongst the states, the incubator of ideas. In the end, you will have fewer Washington strings attached and more cash going to roads, bridges, and whatever a particular state wants to build. So I'll wrap up my opening remarks by preemptively answering some of my critics. And you might imagine there are a few critics to an idea such as this. Number one, people will say, well, this is that anti-bike path bill, anti-transit. They wonder, how will states have the money for bike paths and commuter trains? Well, I'm a triathlete. I love riding bikes, and I love riding bikes on nice bike paths. But I don't believe our neighborhood should have Washington, D.C. dictating to them how their bike paths should be, nor how they should be funded. The T-Act actually lets states freely choose how, when, and where to build the transportation infrastructure that they desire, that's most important to their local communities, with their very own money. Now, secondly, some are worried that this leaves states with a small tax base those with a small tax base hanging out to dry. How can the states out west with lower populations and long roads survive without federal help? Well, first, their projects will cost much less under the T-Act. They can build more with less when they don't have to worry about the 10-year DOT delay or the 10% Davis-Bacon cost. That alone could make the difference. And secondly, the bill still provides that 3.7 cents per gallon for interstate projects, that federal revenue stream, which could be used for those needs. Now, thirdly, some members of Congress think it's easier to hike up the gas tax. It always seems to be much easier just to raise taxes on the American people as opposed to what we want to do. They might want to create a mileage-based user fee or otherwise increase the money paid to Washington. These ideas might work on the state level, but that should be up to each and individual state, not up to Washington. Again, if transportation dollars come through Washington, then Washington is in control, and the cash that they send to us will just get wrapped up in that red tape. And here's one story from Georgia. It was Kyle Wingfield, a columnist for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. He wrote how the Georgia Department of Transportation wanted to build a road that was just 1.5 miles long. The estimated cost was $16 million. Doesn't sound like a lot here in Washington, but I can tell you for the state of Georgia, that is a lot of money. Georgia didn't have all the money it needed, so it got $4.6 million from the federal government. We thought we hit the lottery, says a DOT board member. Then Washington ordered additional environmental reviews. Then they found an endangered species in a nearby creek. The project was delayed 5 more years and an added cost of $9 million. So, of course, this project, twice as much as Georgia had gotten from Washington, and now they had to come up with even more money. Now, I think some in Washington are opposed to this idea for a simple reason, and it's the idea of fear. I believe they fear it might actually work. And if it were to work, let's be honest, their power and their relevancy is diminished, while the power and the relevancy of the states is renewed. And if this were to actually work, which I believe it will, we would have set the precedent for transferring more power to the states in more cases, one by one. And you have to ask the question, and this is the question that's rolling around Washington right now, what agency is next? thank you for letting me join you today, and I look forward to taking part in the program.
Thanks, Tom. And I would like to invite the rest of our panel up here for discussion. Joining us on the panel today will be Ken Orski. Ken's worked in the transportation field for more than 30 years, serving at the Urban Mass Transportation Administration under Presidents Nixon and Ford, and as a consultant and counsel to more than 30 state and local jurisdictions on transportation-related issues. So we are lucky to have him here. We'll also be joined by Emily Goff, who's our research associate in the Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Emily is our lead analyst on this issue and is working hard to push this big idea. So thank you for joining us. I will start off with a question, and maybe I'll direct this one to Emily. One of the kind of things you hear a lot around town, and I'm sure you've heard it, Congressman, is you hear a lot of our Republican friends who are, saying they're conservative on this issue, but really the conservative position on this issue is to be, pouring money into transportation and infrastructure projects, and they'll make a lot of justifications for that. I wonder, Emily, if you could kind of take us back a little bit to kind of a founder level view and talk about what the founders had to say about federal and state roles in transportation. How does that kind of relate to where we are right now with that perspective?
Absolutely. The general idea is to spend more and more on infrastructure, and I think that the states probably would be interested in doing that, but the question you need to ask is which level of government should be the one that's making those funding and then program management decisions. The thrust of this policy proposal would be to have that decision-making be brought back closer to home at the state and local level. And if you look back at what the founders intended, what they laid out in the Constitution, you see a beautiful division of powers that really is at the heart of the Constitution and the way things were laid out. And the basic idea is that national issues will be addressed at the national level, so here in Washington, and state and local issues will be addressed at the state and local levels of government. We see a distortion of that in the current arrangement of the highway bill, as the Congressman mentioned, with the addition of activities that are truly local in nature, bike paths, transit. These activities are not inherently bad, but they're simply not Washington priorities. They're the prerogatives of the state and local governments to implement those. So two quick clauses that you often see as justification for a bigger federal role. One would be the general spending clause, so for the general welfare. And this is a misinterpretation of what the original intent was. Again, it gets back to the idea of Washington spending for the general welfare, things that are of the general concern, national in scope. And then also you see the Commerce Clause invoked as well to justify a big federal role. And here I would say that the intent is for the federal government to not erect barriers and to remove barriers that prohibit interstate commerce, not to be actively involved in interstate commerce. If you take that latter line of logic, there is no limiting principle. There is nowhere you stop with that clause.
Great, thank you. Ken, let me get you involved here. A lot of the critics say that the state's ability or interest to handle this transportation funding is not really there, that they wouldn't be able to do it the right way. Talk us through why that's wrong.
First, let me commend Representative Graves for his clear vision and excellent presentation. I think we all wish him well in his pursuit. And I do apologize for my voice. I'm fighting laryngitis. I hope I'll survive through this meeting. Well, it may come as a surprise to some of you, but there is a quiet revolution underway in transportation funding. And I think this is consistent with what the representative is trying to do. Faced with a depleted highway trust fund and uncertain prospects for more money from Congress, many states are now taking matters into their own hands and aggressively pursuing more fiscal independence. A survey we have conducted recently documents significant funding initiatives in more than 18 states. Now, some states have raised their gasoline taxes, such as Maryland. Others have shifted to a tax on fuel at the wholesale level. An outstanding example is Pennsylvania. Still others have enacted dedicated sales tax for transportation, Virginia, for example. And yet others have floated toll revenue bonds. Now, further evidence of local initiative came on election day last November, when voters approved over 70% of ballot measures to increase or extend funding for local transportation. Let me cite you something that a senior state transportation official said to me when he commented on our recent survey of state funding initiatives. He said, what you're seeing in the governors and state legislatures' realistic assessment of and pragmatic response to the fiscal realities in Washington. And he added, we realize the era of free-flowing federal dollars is over. It's up to us now to find a new way. So it would seem to me that the federal budgetary realities are actually helping to achieve de facto some of the objectives that Congressman Kasich pursued way back in the 1990s, and more recently Representative Graves and Senator Lee hope to accomplish through the Transportation Empowerment Act. Now, admittedly, what we're seeing out in the states is not full-scale devolution as envisioned in the Empowerment Act, but it is a significant step, I think, in the direction of shifting more transportation decision-making to the state and local level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, one of the things that you hear all the time when we get into this is, but what about urban mass transit, right? What about subways, streetcars, bus systems, whatever it is? Won't that all crumble if we go in this direction? Talk us through that. Emily?
I'll start off, and then Ken, if you want to chime in. Congressman Graves referenced this, bike paths, transit, some of the other activities that are purely local in nature. The way that the system is structured now, whether it's through Highway Trust Fund dollars or federal grant programs funded through the appropriations process, so general taxpayer dollars, it incentivizes the state, it gives these states the incentive to pursue projects that are more capital intensive than they would otherwise pursue. And it biases them towards a construction solution when perhaps a non-construction solution to a congestion problem or a mobility problem would be in order. It gives the illusion of free money from Washington when 80% or up to 80% of a project costs are covered. So under this proposal, you would see the decision-making at the state's level change dramatically. But I would argue towards the direction of being more efficient and really taking stock of what is it that we can afford. And then the beautiful thing that starts is that the states will start to think, how can we employ private sector resources? How can we attract that capital rather than depending on the money coming from Washington? So on the issue of transit and other kind of capital-intensive projects, the type of transit might change. States might pursue bus rapid transit as opposed to subway, the subway systems of the world, because they're simply less expensive and they're more adaptable to whatever the traffic patterns are in that particular area. The decision-making would change, but I don't think that you would see states wholly abandon those solutions, particularly in the urban cores where they exist currently.
Well, excuse me, I do see more state role in transit as well. I mean, transit has, and I come from the transit tradition, having been involved in the U.S. Department of Transportation in the mass transit program. But let me refer you to a recent development, and that is the Purple Line. The Purple Line may become the first example where the state cooperates with the private sector to build and operate, actually, a rail line. Now, admittedly, not all the ducks are in a row yet. There's a lot of work ahead, but I think it does show a certain mentality and a certain trend that is developing among the states of seeing how they can solve their transportation problems, including transit, at the state level rather than always depend on the federal government.
Yeah, one of the things, Tom, you said at the end of your remarks here, I think is worth kind of going a little bit more into depth on. I mean, this really is, obviously, this is good policy in and of itself, and we like it for that reason. But it's extremely exciting for the reason that you point out, which is that if this were to happen, what's that mean for the rest of the way that the federal government operates? And it really is kind of like one of those symbolic moments that could be very big for this country. And it's kind of what we did on the Farm Bill. You know, we're trying on the Farm Bill to end that, you know, unholy alliance between rural Republicans and urban Democrats, and that could end up being really big for the country. I look at this as the same kind of thing. We can begin to really challenge the status quo with this kind of thing. But what I wonder is how many of your colleagues recognize it for that? And have they talked to you about it? I mean, or is this more of a kind of parochial, we've always done it this way? I mean, talk us through that.
Well, that's a good point. I would say that one of the challenges, obviously I outlined it, one challenge is that there's a fear that it may succeed, and with that becomes a diminishing of power for those that are used to the system as it exists. But there needs to be a paradigm shift in how we operate here in Washington, and it takes bold ideas like this in which you say there's something in place that's been there since 1956, and it had a relevant purpose at that time, and it had a finite defined period and purpose, and we have overextended that stay. And so what's a 21st century solution to that? And I would contend that my constituents and the American people feel like the states are better at handling their dollars than the federal government. If you were to poll, I would imagine that constituents trust their state elected officials a little better than they trust their federal elected officials. The closer you're to home, the closer that accountability, I believe, the better. As it relates to transit or any other project, I think it's just better determined in each and every local community. And when you now lay out the case that here is something that is very doable. This is something that I believe can happen, that we can take a part of the federal government and devolve it back to the states and acknowledge and humbly acknowledge that states, you are far better at doing this than the federal government is, and we trust you with it because we're not doing a good job of it. And when we acknowledge that as elected officials and we're willing, with courage, to hand that back over to the states, I think the states then would stand up and say, you know what, there's this other little area of the federal government that we think we can do a little better with. How about giving us a shot? It doesn't matter if it's one state, 10 states, or all states. Let's just give them a shot. And I'd put my money on the states to do a better job than the federal government.
Indeed. Indeed. All right, well, why don't we open it up for some questions? Right here.
Government should work. My basic question on how the difference between how the founders would view an issue like this, and we're not living in the founders' age. We're living today. And I know one side says, who cares what they thought? This is today. How do you answer that question?
Ironically enough, it actually isn't an issue of one side saying this is what they thought, and then the other side, talking politically, there's not a vast amount of disagreement among the two sides. You actually have a lot of overlap. Transportation is one of those fun issues that transcends party boundaries. So I think you have members on both sides of the aisle and advocates, I could say, in the transportation community arguing for a big federal role, justifying it based on precedent or based on what they view as what the Constitution, how it's laid out in the Constitution. But I draw them back to, and I hope I don't extend beyond my realm and my colleagues in our Center for Principles in Politics. This is their bailiwick, but I'll offer it what I can. There is that division of powers that is so fundamental and crucial to the way that the founders intended for this great nation to operate. The federal government to be concerned with the federal responsibilities, national things in scope, and then the state and local governments doing what is in their jurisdiction. Where that exact line is, that's part of this debate, but I think you can clearly say that right now we are on one end of the spectrum and we need to be moving back towards the other end of the spectrum where we revisit that correct division of powers. And so whether or not we're living in the 19th, 21st, or 22nd century, I think that foundation, those principles stand true.
Others? Right here.
What's your sense of how the states feel about devolving power back to them on transportation? I mean, I'm sure there's a variety across the states, but
Sure.
are they in favor of this?
I'll take a stab at it first. I can really speak to Georgia best. And that's where it was brought to me first, was from a resolution that was passed through the Georgia House and Senate with bipartisan support, I believe with maybe only 1 to 4 no's between the House and the Senate combined, saying, let them do this. And I think you'll find there's a general frustration amongst states as it relates to highway funding and the priorities and the I guess how slow it is, and you know they're so close to their constituencies, and they're trying to get things done, and they realize, you know what, it's the federal government that's holding us up, and there's only so many times they can keep telling their constituents that. So I would say that Georgia has embraced this very strongly, and for the reasons I alluded to in my remarks, it's not really about dollars and debt and balance sheets. This is about lives of our constituents who just want to be able to spend more time with their family and less time in traffic. You know, more time in life than sitting behind the wheel. And so I think that's what's exciting about this, is it touches everyone in all walks of life all throughout our country.
Great. You want to add to that?
I agree with the congressman. I think there is strong sentiment in almost every state. And this is particularly the case now that states have realized, and state political bodies have realized that they can raise money locally for transit and as well as highways. States have become more fiscally independent now because they have embraced long-term financing and easier access to private capital through public-private partnerships. So as states realize that they are more competent to attract private money and to generate enthusiasm among their electorate for transportation, I think that sentiment is going to grow appreciably.
Great. Right over here.
Congressman, I guess I'd fear that as you devolve the role of the states, that they would start to enact more toll roads in the public-private partnerships model, and then you'd get backlash of, well, now you have so many toll roads, it feels like it's more expensive to drive. Even though it might not be, it feels like it's more expensive. So are you prepared to counteract that attack that's going to eventually come up?
Well, I trust that might be an option that various states choose. It's been successful with various states and various projects. I don't foresee that as being something that an entire state's can be told, but I think that is an option that states look towards. But part of the reason it's difficult to impose today is that the cost to recover the project is so much that the tolls would be so high because of the red tape and the regulations that come from this federal government, that you remove that, then tolls might be a little bit lower and more reasonable and work within the project more. But that may be one option, but you hear a lot of different ideas, and that's what excites me about this, is that one state may prefer a toll method, one state may prefer the mileage-based tax method or the current excise tax or a sales tax, whatever it might be, and that's quite all right with me. That's what we should be for, is letting the states determine what's best for them based on their habits in transportation. And I do want to add this too. What makes this a unique discussion is that the excise tax from the federal government's an embedded tax that is not transparent whatsoever. You go fill up your car, your truck at the gas station, you see a value per gallon. You don't realize many times that, or most folks don't know, that it's 18.4 cents going to the federal government, and in the case of Georgia, you're not getting that back to your roads. And if you knew it was going towards your roads, you know, you'd feel good about that. But now folks are starting to learn, wait, we're not getting everything that we're paying in, and the exchange rate of the federal government's too high for us. Let's leave it in the states.
Ken or Emily, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, all I would add to this is that we do see considerable sentiment in favor of toll roads in some states. It's, as the congressman pointed out, it's not a uniform solution for every state. Some states are more friendly, and their electorates are more friendly toward tolls than others. And that has to do very often with the extent to which the public has been exposed to toll roads. We in the East, for example, who travel on New Jersey Turnpike and Connecticut Turnpike and so on, accept tolls as a matter of fact. There are many other states, however, still are rather suspicious of tolls, and that goes particularly for state legislatures.
To echo the sentiments here, it's not going to be, I don't think, a situation where, as the congressman said, tolls are going to be just pervasive. There's political realities on the ground among the states and localities that's going to be resistance to widespread tolling if it doesn't make sense there, if the constituents aren't interested in that. But you know, it would free the states to explore things such as congestion pricing on really busy corridors. Where you pay a small fee through your Easy Pass, what we have here, Peach Pass in Georgia, kind of a way to pay a toll there, but a nominal fee that better reflects the cost of using that corridor during rush hour, for example. So I think that the form of tolls could take, a variety of forms at the state level.
And Tim, if I could add one thing, just thinking about this, the original intent of the 1956 legislation, in essence, was like a toll over a certain period of time that had a sunset, and as with most tolls, they typically don't go away, right? And that's what happened here. But when there's pressure from the electorate, tolls, once they pay for the project, it's a user fee, and the electorate lets their voices be heard, tolls tend to diminish, as is the case in Georgia with one major toll that was removed here recently, toll booths.
All right, I have one question. Well, others? I have a question before we end. Tom, I wonder if you could. I mean, so we've established that there's an appetite for this at the state level. There's certainly a growing body of conservatives who view this as very, very important, and it's a priority for us. But kind of walk us through what needs to happen between where we are today and the next highway reauthorization for us to have a shot on this.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that, because at the end of this fiscal year, in September, the reauthorization of transportation funding that's the renewal period. And we're interjecting this now into the debate about how do we fund transportation in the future as an alternative, as an idea to be a part of that debate. And this is a bipartisan concept, because you take the state of Georgia, and the resolutions that have been passed on multiple occasions have bipartisan support. And so I would hope that this doesn't fall down partisan lines, but it's about a solution. So for those that are watching, or those that might learn of this later, I hope they'll contact their congressmen and senators and let them know that they're interested in empowering their states, which is not necessarily empowering the state itself. It's empowering those within the state to make decisions that are best in their best interest. Because it's their tax dollars. So this is an exciting opportunity, I think, for the American people to engage and say, you know what, we want this back, and the only way that that's going to happen is if you get enough folks co-sponsoring and voting yes for it as we move forward into the fall.
Well, we'll certainly do our part to push that. All right, well, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel and our speaker. We have a 10-minute break, and we'll be talking with Senator Tim Scott next on school choice. So 10 minutes.